All right. So it's our great pleasure and honor to have today the great Ford Doolittle. He's the first speaker of the year for this PhilInBioMed seminar series. As you all know, Ford is a very famous professor emeritus at the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the Dalhousie University in Halifax in Canada. He's an evolutionary and molecular biologist. He's well known for many different things, including his study of cyanobacteria and also his very interesting critiques to the tree of life, among many other things. Um, Ford is not just a great biologist, he's also a great photographer and a great philosopher. I don't know if we will see some pictures taken by Ford, but I'm sure we'll
No,
hear
maybe
some
you won't.
biology and some philosophy today. Ford, thank you very much for agreeing to give this talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomas. Um, so you can all hear me, I would guess. Tomas can anyway. But but stop me if I'm inaudible in some ways. Not if I mumble though. So my title is Making Evolutionary Sense of Gaia, and that's what I'm trying to do. And okay, so where's the next slide here? There it is. My goal is a very modest one for this talk, which is namely to legitimize the Gaia hypothesis and other claims for a multi-species community evolution in a way that Darwin would approve of if he were alive today and had been through all the changes that evolutionary theory has been through. I I was thinking the other day that I think I probably take a bottom approach. I'm trying to Darwinize Gaia rather um, than come at it from the more holistic perspective. So I think that, and I'm not trying to prove that the Gaia hypothesis is actually correct. I'm just trying to make it legitimate. And this is all a very long book ad because I've got my first solo book coming out with MIT Press on December 3rd, and I recommend that you all buy it. It's called Darwinizing Gaia. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Um, Talking a little bit about the Gaia hypothesis for those who don't know what it is. I will say then that Darwinists at the time, and mostly still, consider the Gaia hypothesis illegitimate, or wrong in some way. That's because it's not a Darwinian. Gaia is not a Darwinian individual in their view. And I will go through a failed attempt to rescue the Gaia hypothesis using Lewontin's recipe for differential reproduction, which was suggested to me by Elliot Sober, who fortunately cannot be with us, but who was an honoree of this association previously. Um, and then I will go through two possibly successful attempts to rescue the Gaia hypothesis, Darwinizing it, either modifying Lewontin's recipe to include differential persistence as well as differential reproduction, or using a gene's eye view approach to the Gaia hypothesis. So, what is the Gaia hypothesis? It's the notion that founded by Jim Lovelock, I think, and Diane Hitchcock, and then soon joined. Lovelock was joined by Lynn Margulis, a radical evolutionary biologist. Both of them dead now, but only Lovelock very recently. And they said that the Gaia hypothesis, this is one statement of theirs, the total ensemble of living organisms which constitutes the biosphere can act as a single entity to regulate chemical compositions, surface pH, and possibly also climate. The notion of the biosphere is an active adaptive control system able to maintain the Earth in homeostasis. We are calling the Gaia hypothesis. So it had evolutionary implications, at least it did at the time. And Lovelock, in his book, in his public book, published for the public in general, which I read in 1979, referred to it as the largest living creature on Earth. But the real issue for Darwinians, I guess, is Gaia a unit of selection in the Godfrey Smithian sense that a unit of selection is meant. And evolutionary biology at the time was going through a very reductionist period. I think it's possibly still reductionist, but less so, I think. But it was particularly reductionist in the time. It was partly, I think, to make itself into a science because physics was the model and physics was reductionist at the time, or at least Newtonian physics was. And I think that's one of the reasons. And for another reason was that two books that were very influential for evolutionary theorists, Adaptation and Natural Selection, published by George Williams in 1966, and The Selfish Gene, published by Richard Dawkins in 1976, bracketed or preceded by 3 years the Gaia hypothesis book. So I think it was very reductionist, and I think it bought into Lewontin's recipe, which is the three components of it. So I think whenever there's variation and heredity and fitness, there will be natural selection. And Lewontin said that. So I think Lewontin's recipe implies differential reproduction or lineage formation. It's implicit in the parent-offspring relationships. But also in principle, this allows for, it also allows for multi-level selection theory. So it applies at various different levels, which I will talk about soon. And so I think it's often summarized as heritable variation in fitness. Fitness being cashed out in terms of differential reproduction. And so I objected to the Gaia hypothesis as a typical Darwinian, 1980s and soon thereafter. I objected to the Gaia hypothesis in an article in the Coevolution Quarterly, which was accompanied, however, by Glenn Margulis and Jim Lovelock's comments on my article. And basically, I said that Gaia does not reproduce, so there can be no heritable variation in fitness, and so it doesn't actually conform to Lewontin's recipe. There is no heritable variation in fitness because it doesn't reproduce. And I said in conclusion, well, I said several other things in that article, but I said in particular that I do doubt that I do not. Yes, I'm sorry. I don't doubt that globular homeostatic relationships sometimes exist, as Peter Godfrey Smith said in his recent book, but that they were caused by natural selection or that they're anything but accidental, I did doubt. So I think they're just fortuitous benefits. At least I thought that then. And Richard Dawkins said said the same thing about a year later. He said that the universe would have to be full of dead planets whose homeostatic regulation systems had failed, with dotted around a handful of successful, well-regulated planets, of which the Earth is one. In addition, we would have to postulate some kind of reproduction whereby successful planets spawn copies of their life forms on new planets. So that's what Dawkins said. And I think in particular, that emphasizes, again, the differential reproduction aspect of Lewontin's recipe. And Peter Godfrey Smith says this same thing in a review of Lovelock's recent book, well, relatively recent, possibly his last book. And in 2015, Peter Godfrey Smith said this feedback between different living things is indeed ubiquitous, and some kinds of feedback help life to continue. There are fortuitous byproducts, but those benefits to life are byproducts. They're accidental. The interactions between species are consequences of the traits and behaviors that evolutionary processes within those species gave rise to, And these processes are driven by reproductive competition within each species. So I think, again, differential reproduction is the essence of Lewontin's recipe. Peter Godfrey Smith also was the source of this particular useful statement, I think. So he said in 212, um, 2012, that evolution by natural selection is change in the population owing to variation, heredity, and differential reproductive success. In other words, he's endorsing Lewontin's recipe. He also endorses multi-level selection theory, in the sense that in the red phrase, the criteria required are abstract: genes, cells, social groups, and species can all, in principle, enter into change of this kind. So he does also that, also endorse in multi-level selection theory, which I do and to endorse. But for any objects to be units of selection in this sense, however, they must be connected by parent-offspring relations. They must have the capacity to reproduce, which Gaia and other multi-species communities don't do. So the notion that Gaia would be a Darwinian individual was a non-starter from the beginning, I think. So Elliot Sober, who unfortunately is not with us, but who has been honored by this by Thomas Bordeaux previously, and is often a frequent of this site, said that actually multi-species communities do reproduce, but like sexual organisms, but they only have more parents. And what he meant by that was this, I think. What he meant by that was that asexual organisms like prokaryotes reproduce having one parent, uniparental. Sexual organisms are biparental. They have two parents, the sperm donor and the egg donor, and therefore they're sexual. And many algae and fungi have alternating sexual and asexual phases, diploid and haploid phases, which both of them undergo selection. So that's no problem. Selection is not a problem. And so what Elliot was saying, I think, was that that multi-species communities, ecosystems, for instance, have many parents, namely all the individuals of however many species that make up the next generation of ecosystems. And I think they do. So that each collective or organism or ecosystem, for instance, multi-species community of organisms can release a propagule, and then the propagules get together, forming the next ecosystem. So there are many parents, all the individuals that however many species that make up the next generation of ecosystems. But Peter Godfrey Smith would also say that there can be too many parents, and I would agree, for Lewontin's recipe. And so basically, he would say that the Darwinian paradigm is simplicity itself, and I think that's probably right, but there are limits. There must be some parent-offspring similarity, and the clarity of a parent-offspring relation of the relevant kind is inversely related to the number of parents. If there are too many parents, there are no parents at all. And I think that is the problem with the multi-species community selection. So how the too many parents concern of Peter Godfrey Smith proceeds with multi-species community or precludes multi-species communities evolving by natural selection. Okay, well, there's three parts to this argument, which I will read. For sexual species, Lewontin's recipe works because offspring resemble one or the other parent, or their average, the two parents. For any trait, there are only two parents, and they're always the same two. So the fact that these are always the same two parents means that there are not too many parents. There are only two. But for multi-species communities, there can easily be too many parents. and I think that's true of multi-species communities like ecosystems, so that each trait can have different parents. For example, the species responsible for photosynthesis is often not the species responsible for nitrogen fixation, and other complicated ecosystems might have several different species contributing several different traits. So for multi-species communities, the parent-offspring resemblance required by Lewontin's recipe increasingly fails. And I would say that Lewontin's recipe fails because there is no longer any particular parent that an offspring resembles. There are too many reproductive lineages. So that doesn't work. Elliott-Silver's solution doesn't work as far as I can see. So now I will go through two possible successful attempts to rescue the Gaia hypothesis, to Darwinize Gaia, in other words. One is, are there any questions, by the way? Can I hear? Can you hear me?
We
I
can,
can't.
and I don't see any questions in the chat, but maybe someone has a
Okay.
question that they want to ask orally, but maybe we can keep them, I mean, take them at the end, as you prefer.
Sure. No, we can. I take them in at the end. I find this method of presentation where I can only see my screen very
I know,
daunting
I
because
know, I know. If there
I
is,
can't communicate with the audience, for God's sakes.
no, I
And
understand that. If there is any pressing question or clarification question, maybe people can ask it in the chat or now, but otherwise, I think, Ford, you can continue.
yeah, okay, but I will continue, but I don't think this will take very long. Um, so there are two possibly successful attempts to rescue the Gaia hypothesis. One is to modify Lewontin's recipe to include differential persistence as well as differential reproduction, which I think it mostly includes because Lewontin's recipe refers to parent-offspring relationships, for instance, as Peter Godfrey Smith does too, or using a gene's eye approach, gene's eye view approach. So, so I think so. This paper by Celso and me, I'm not sure whether Celso's there or not, but I think he meant to be. Which recently appeared last year in Philosophy of Science, is a good model, I think, for evolution by natural selection for clades. So clade selection and its explanatory autonomy. I think this it's a persuasive argument for me, at least. So it analogizes clade selection to chemostat selection. So what is a chemostat? I'm surprised that many people don't know this, but apparently they don't. Chemostat is a device often used by microbiologists to measure growth rates and stuff like that. You can maintain the chemostat at a constant cell density, cells per milliliter, by adjusting the inflow rate and the output rate. So the output consists of medium plus exhausted medium plus cells, and the input consists of only of fresh medium, and you can adjust the rates. So that's fine. And I think this is a good analogy for clade selection in the following sense. So in a chemostat, it's a consequence of the Kimura's neutral evolution model, and also the coalescent model that all cells at some future time will descend from some single cell present in the chemostat at some past time. So I'm showing that on the right. The cell that is circled is the ancestor of all the cells in the chemostat. Before that generation, there are other cells, the descendants of other clades, members of other clades, present, but in the last generation, the top generation, there are only the descendants from that single cell. So I think this is going to be the case. It's automatically the case from coalescent theory or inverse neutral theory of evolution. And so I'm analogizing clones in the chemostat to clades in nature, because I think by Okasha's definition and by most definitions, I think, or by Cladis definitions anyway, clades consist of the ancestor and all of its descendants, either living or dead descendants. And so clades are monophyletic, basically, and they, like clones in the chemostat, don't reproduce. I mean, because anything that is the reproductive product of one of the cells in the clone becomes just a member of that same clone, and similarly, anything that reproduces in a clade becomes a member of that clade. So it's the ancestor plus all of its descendants, living and dead, or dead. That's it. And so Akasha thinks that it doesn't conform to Lewontin's recipe, but it doesn't, because it doesn't reproduce. So given that clades, he says this in 2003, I think he's probably changed his mind now, but given that clades are monophyletic by only one shared ancestor, by definition, it follows by definition that clades do not reproduce. So it can make no sense to talk about clades fitness. So clade selection is impossible. This is, I think, many people's views of clade selection. But I think that's wrong. So what I'm analogizing it to is all of life, actually. So we imagine, or Carl Woese imagined, and I think most people nowadays, most molecular phylogeneticists imagine that life arose at some point, and then subsequently to life, there was a last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, which gave rise to the modern clades called bacteria, eukaryotes, and archaea. And that's all there is, by definition, really. So I think that the last universal common ancestor was probably also a fairly sophisticated cell. Comparisons of bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes today reveal that there are many shared genes between the three domains, and therefore the ancestor probably had a sophisticated form of many enzymes. So it was probably not unique in its time. And so there was a population of wannabe LUCAs that coexisted with the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, at the time, and gave rise to clades and subclades, all of which went extinct. And so their only surviving members are the bacteria and eukaryotes and archaea. And by definition, of course, and I think this is inevitably the case. So that's also model for clade selection, basically. So my model for clade selection is this. Clades, like all life and like clones, and clades, like all life, which is the biotic part of Gaia, or inorganic, or the environmental part of Gaia is also part of Gaia. But the biotic part can't reproduce, by definition. They can only persist or go extinct. And clades can only persist or go extinct, and clones can only persist or go extinct as well. But clades, like clones, continuously generate their own lower level populations, the species that compete to found the future clade. And they do this continually, because I mean, it's necessitated by the analogy that I'm trying to draw between clones and clades. but I think by common sense as well, that we believe that there was a population at one time, and that all modern things are a descendant of one element of that population, or one cell in that population, or one species in that population. So, so what are the properties by which clades are selected for? And I think those unique persistence promoting or extinction promoting characteristics of clades are namely size. The larger clades will go extinct less often than smaller clades if the extinction is random, the species is random. Secondly, and probably more importantly, ecological diversity is an important factor of a clade, so that if organisms produced by the clade have, for instance, different temperature optima, then no single temperature is favorable to all of them. But that means that whatever the temperature, some of them will survive. So that's ecological diversity is an important thing. The geographical dispersal is an important thing too. Obviously, the more broadly distributed around the globe a species is, or clade is, the more likely it is to survive, and mutual aid. So counting lateral gene transfer is the most obvious form of mutual aid, and of course, close phylogenetic relatives often share more genes with each other than distant phylogenetic relatives for simple reasons having to do with that distance. And the mere fact that organisms are mutually edible is an important feature of organisms. So those are what I think Peter Godfrey Smith previously used to call fortuitous byproducts, but I think this makes accidental byproducts into selectable traits. They are selectable for persistence of the clone or the clade that emerges from the competition within individuals, I think. So they're selectable traits. And I think this is what two Serbs, Yankovic and Srkovic, were driving at when they wrote this paper, Evolvabilities and Evolvability, the coding concept as the arch unit of natural selection. And I will just read that whole point, that whole quote. This biosphere, be it alone or one of many, is accordingly a product of natural selection, since the overall evolvability conferred by its coding concept, nucleic acids as information carriers with a rulebook of meanings provided by codons, as well as all the subsystems that regulate various conditional information reading modes, certainly played a key role in enabling this biosphere to survive up to the present through alternations of planetary conditions, including at least 5 events linked to major mass extinctions. In other words, there are reasons why Luca was selected. And I think it was selected as a clade, as a persistent, for persistence rather than extinction. Or sorry, for persistence, yes, rather than extinction, but not for differential reproduction by definition. So I think I'm invoking downward causation, which I define as whenever there are more or less lower level units than there would have otherwise been because of selection impinging on a higher level. So that's what my definition of downward causation is, and this is very similar to what Donald Campbell, one of my postdocs, referred to as the founder of downward causation, or probably not the founder, but the most articulate expressor of it, holds that he holds that this happens when processes at the lower level, lower levels of a hierarchy are restrained by and act in conformity to the laws of the higher level. And I think that's exactly what I'm saying. So if we are to use Lewontin's recipe to this is the fourth point. If we are to use Lewontin's recipe to make this process possible, evolution by natural selection For persistence, we'd have to allow that selection can occur at a higher level, clone or clade level, than the reproduction, although it doesn't have to be at a particularly higher level. So cell species or subclades. So one of the arguments that I put in a previous slide was that um, the clone only achieves fixation at some point, and prior to that, there are other subclones, subclades that compete with it, which establishes the population. So that's my point. Um, so we'd have to modify Lewontin's recipe, at least I think we would have to modify it. There's variation in morphological, physiological, behavioral traits of members of a population. That not too modifiable. Not a serious modification. The variation is in part heritable, so that individuals resemble their relations more than they resemble unrelated individuals, and in particular, clones clades in this past resemble clones clades in the present. This is perhaps the most dubious claim, but I think it's a legitimate claim. So, and that's the substitution for the principle of heredity. And different variants lead different numbers of offspring, either in immediate or remote generations. That principle of fitness stays the same. So I think we can modify Lewontin's recipe as in the green text there. Or we can use a gene's eye approach. So I'm going to finish off with talking about the gene's eye approach. So this is mostly what the Dawkins-Hull gene's eye view already does, I think. And I'll just read the last part, the red part. Selection is a process in which the differential extinction and proliferation of interactors causes the differential perpetuation of the replicators that produce them. So what I mean by that is this. So the pink ellipses correspond to organisms that are both replicators and reproducers and interactors. So they both reproduce each other. Species reproduce in the sense of speciation events, at least. And sexual organisms and asexual organisms obviously reproduce, and cells reproduce, and genes replicate themselves. So, or at least they are replicated by themselves. So, all those things are those pink things. The pink ellipses are potentially reproducers and therefore subject to Lewontin's recipe. Lewontin's recipe does apply to them. But the larger units of the hierarchy of life, the multi-species communities, are the Gaia hypothesis, are the Gaia as a whole, as a collection of all those multi-species communities, doesn't replicate, doesn't reproduce, or at the most it would have too many parents in the Peter Gottfried Smithian sense. So non-reproducers, interactors, so non-reproducers are interactors only. So Lewontin's recipe does not apply, but an extended gene's eye view does, I think. That's all I'm saying. And I realized relatively recently that my previous theory, or our previous theory, it's the song, not the singers, is an instantiation of the David Hall, Richard Dawkins view, the gene's eye view, which is that, well, I'll just read that part from the abstract of a recent paper. Few consider as units of selection in their own right the processes implemented by genes, cells, species, or communities. It's the song, not the singer, or It's Nuts theory does that, also claiming that evolution by natural selection of processes is more easily understood and explained as a differential persistence or recurrence than as differential reproduction, which I think is true. I mean, it doesn't reproduce in the real sense, but it does recur or persist. This is a relatively common view amongst microbiologists, I think. So three of them, Paul Falkowski and Tom Finchel and Ed DeLong, said this in 2008. In essence, microbes can be viewed as vessels that ferry metabolic machines through strong environmental perturbations into vast stretches of relatively mundane geological landscapes. The individual taxonomic units evolve and go extinct, yet the core machines survive surprisingly unperturbed. And I think it's the core machines, the songs, that outsurvive the singers. So um, I've come to the end of the talk. I just have to thank people. A whole bunch of philosophers and modelers have contributed to this talk and various ways. And I would like to thank them and also thank the funders, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Insert Canadian Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ford.
So that was sort of incoherent, but then again, I'm reduced to incoherence when I only face the screen.
Don't, don't worry. It was so let me see. Maybe I can have a maybe we perhaps Ford, you could stop sharing if this is okay for you, because we do see.
Yeah, oh, and I can stop sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, great. I can see everyone now. Um, we have a first question or comment by Tyler.
I wasn't expecting to go first. Okay. I just thought, well, in the last part of your talk, you present that sort of gene's eye view with the hierarchical structure, and at the top you have multi-species communities and then Gaia. But
Right.
it seems to me like the difference between multi-species community assemblages and Gaia is one of scale or degree rather than kind, whereas the other distinctions lower in the diagram are ones of kind. So it seems perfectly
Um,
plausible that there are some dead planets out there in which there was only Gaia on one little island, or there was only Gaia in some pocket of the atmosphere, or something like that. So it seems to me that if you could solve the problem for multi-species communities, then it would, if you could solve it in principle for multi-species communities, then it would be solved for Gaia as well.
I guess I would disagree in the sense that we can solve it for one particular multi-species community, let's say the community involved in the nitrogen cycle, and that doesn't mean anything for the other cycles. So whether the whole thing operates as a unit, well, I've legitimized that notion. I haven't actually proven it, and I don't claim to have proven it.
Yeah,
Um,
what I mean is this. Suppose the community that accomplishes the nitrogen cycle is a
sure.
multi-species community. And suppose the community that accomplishes the carbon cycle is a multi-species community. Then the collective
Hmm.
of the community that accomplishes the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle is also a multi-species community. There's no amount of adding them together that makes that thing no longer a
Okay, well, sure. Oh, sure. Well, it's the question is whether it's a community or not.
right.
So whether it's an organism or not. And Peter Godfrey Smith says.
Could it be too big to be a community?
Well, it cannot interact with each other, right?
Sorry,
I mean,
I'm maybe taking up too much time here, but I'll push the point a little bit. So, but surely they do interact with one another. Like we know that the organisms that are involved in forming the
oh,
nitrogen
sure. Well,
wouldn't
they do.
survive were
Yes,
it not for the organisms that are involved in the carbon
right.
cycle. So that seems to make them a community.
Yeah, okay. I mean, whatever. I don't really much care.
Okay.
Huh.
I think Scott.
Okay.
Uh,
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm thinking of the dead planets issue and wondering if, going back to things that Tim Lenton said about, snowball Earth and, hothouse Earth being alternatives to the present Holocene Gaia. And so could there be kind of, selection for these, equilibrium conditions, uh, such that there are alternatives to the current Gaia?
yeah, I don't have any stake on that one way or the other, I guess. There are alternatives to the current Gaia for sure. Um, yeah,
So
I don't
I
see
guess
any
is
objection to
this
that.
would this be the equivalent to the dead planets, basically? The
Oh, right. Well, so the purpose of my clade selection argument
Mhm.
was that
Right.
that clade selection, to the extent that we're all one clade, which we are, after all, because we're all descendants of Luca, um, or so we are one clade. But it's sort of like the fixation of an allele in a population in
Mhm.
population genetics, right? I mean, once
Yep.
the allele is fixed,
Right.
there's no selection anymore.
Mhm. Yeah.
But just before that, there is selection. So
Yeah.
um, I don't see a problem with it, and so that was one of the things that I was trying to point out, I guess, probably incoherently that you don't have to go back to when the ancestor existed to find the population. You can find the population up until the point where all the things become
Right.
descendants
Yeah.
of one thing. Right.
Yeah.
So, um,
Peter has a question or comment.
uh,
Okay, yeah. Firstly, Ford, you've convinced me more or less completely that it's important to redo all these issues again in the context of Gaia and not assume that the best account of evolution by natural selection for organisms like us is the only possible way to
sure,
rescue
right.
Gaia or the best possible way to rescue Gaia. Um, I completely accept that. So we should just rethink the opposition between the Lewontin type classical account of evolution by natural selection and rivals, in particular, the Hull-Dawkins
Yeah,
replicator
exactly,
interrupter rival.
exactly. That was my point, right?
Yeah, so I agree with that. Next question is, okay, is it is the best way to make sense of Gaia to reapply that framework or to come up with something a little different from anything on the table so far? Should we feel, I mean, we shouldn't feel that we're beholden to the framework that Hull thought would work for genes and organisms.
No,
And
and
in the light of that, um, songs as recurring objects are an important feature of the situation. Songs as opposed to singers, songs as recurring
mhm.
objects. Songs are not much like interactors. I mean, there's some analogy between songs in
Yeah,
your sense and interactors, but one relevant difference is interactors in the whole sense are these big things that contain replicators as parts. And the interaction between the interactor and the environment leads to some replicators doing well or badly. A song is really not like that. It's a recurring object that's produced somehow and that has consequences of some kind for evolutionary processes, but it's not something that houses replicators. It's a
well,
different kind of object. I'll go
yeah,
on. I've got a few more things, but let me pause there and just see if
well, I mean, I sort of agree with you, but I sort of don't agree with you either. Um, because a given song, like I said, the nitrogen cycle does favor the replication of all the entities that contribute to that cycle, right? Even though those entities might change over time, it does favor those entities. Um, so I don't quite know why it's not an interactor, but I agree that it's not an interactor interacts with the environment in any particular unitary way. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't
Okay,
thought about it.
maybe I was thinking of the role of the terminology a bit differently. I was thinking that
Yeah,
we can recognize songs as distinct from singers as important objects and bring them into the story. And once we do that, the nitrogen cycle is not very song-like. It sort of has its own properties.
yeah,
And look, maybe it's closer to a Hullian interactive than it is to
yeah.
a
I think it's
song
closer to that.
recurring
It
object.
is. I mean, I want to expand the Holian interactor thing too, obviously, but so yeah, I don't care really. And but I think one of the cryptic issues here is that I think you could possibly say that there's giant Gaian genes, but there's not a Gaia.
Could you say that
That
again?
it's an extended phenotype kind of situation where Gaia has a collection of genes, but it isn't a collection of, it doesn't exist as an entity, which is
Okay.
fine too.
I don't want to take up too much more time, but I want to just sort of mention a couple more points perhaps as well. I think I get that. One is, suppose we think of recurrence as an important feature of evolutionary processes in
Hmm.
general. And, one example of a recurring object is the sporophyte or the gametophyte stage of an organism
Hmm.
that has alternation of generations. They don't reproduce because they don't make more things like themselves, but they
Right,
keep coming back.
right.
And a story about evolution has to make good sense of these objects that keep coming back. They make a difference, but they don't make more things like themselves. I
Mm.
get that. At one point, and I won't try to sort of track back the exact slide, you had persistence and recurrence as kind of, I'm not sure if they were supposed to be kind of equivalent alternatives to reproduction or what exactly their relation was. But one important difference, at least for me, between persisting objects and recurring objects is that recurring objects can multiply. You can have 100 in this generation when you had only one in the previous generation. Whereas persistence is not like that, it doesn't have the multiplication feature. And
Right.
that I think is a really important characteristic, even from the point of view of a very abstracted version of Darwinism, because multiplication matters to origin explanations. You've got, you know, lots of objects from which novelty can arise, as opposed to just this thing continues or it doesn't continue.
Right.
It may endogenously change. Um, it may not. Um, but either way, persistence and recurrence are they're different kinds of things. And I wanted to,
Yeah, no,
um,
I think they are different kinds of things. I think that my argument, the Gaia argument, the clade-like selection argument, was meant to counter your objection and Nakash's objection to um, persistence because the community just dwindles and dwindles, right? And I'm arguing that the community does replenish itself um, continually um, through clade selection or clone selection. So that's the unique thing about clades and clones, I think.
Perhaps I'll think about that and just mention the last thing I wanted to have on the table, which is when we were in that session with Tim Lenton a few years
Hmm.
ago on Gaia, and he introduced the learning like sequential version of a selection
Right.
process. I thought of that as kind of a surprise and potentially a big deal, at least in principle. I thought, oh, right, that really does add something to the picture that I hadn't,
Hmm.
I at least hadn't seen. Now, as I understand your picture, you're not making use of the thing in his picture that seemed striking to me, which was the idea that if you have these crashes and restarts, if everything goes to hell
Right.
and then comes back and goes to hell and comes back, it does have a kind of trial and error characteristic where,
Hmm.
things
Right.
didn't work out, so you try again. Things didn't work out, so you try again. And it's not like persistence because you can sort of do a fresh start. You can reconfigure things that couldn't be reconfigured at least easily if the same structure was just continuing through time and exhibiting special persistence properties.
Hmm.
So I did want to ask you, do you see your account as a kind of just an alternative to the Lenten picture here? And that's how it seemed to me. It's like you might say, well, he might be right. His mechanism might be real. My mechanism might be real. They could both work together. There's no kind of clash between them, but they are distinct. Or is there more of a kind of concord, more of a kind of, this is the same kind of general
Yeah, I
structure?
don't. I haven't thought enough about that really. Um, so I mean, his sequential selection, I think, is what we're referring to.
Yeah.
Um, is I haven't thought about that much, and its relationship to it's the song about the singer. So I don't know that at the moment.
Okay. Um, to me, it seems like, at least in principle, kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff about the literature on the evolution of learning, right? And I think that's part of that um, connection, but I don't know what that connection is yet.
okay.
Um,
If it's okay, Tomas, I'll just offer one quick thought, then I'll stop, which is, um, in classical Darwinism, you have multiplication, which is this
sure.
non-centralized, localized process in which some do well and some do badly, and that leads to change in the population.
Hmm.
And we're looking at somewhat, different but analogous versions of that. And a feature that's hard to recapture outside of classical Darwinism is the kind of um, take it back to almost nothing and restart, the fresh start, the trial and error. Let's do it all again, see how it goes feature. And that seems to me to be a powerful aspect of his mechanism, that he thinks the Earth has some of these, at least, not a lot of them, but some of them. And I guess I find myself looking for something like that, or wondering whether that's recaptured in your clade-based view, or whether it's just a feature of his view only.
Of Tim's view. I don't know. I guess I'll think about that too. But yeah,
Okay,
thank,
I should
thank you.
stop, and I will think more about clades.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay,
I
good.
think Tyler wants to say something that is directly related to Peter's point, I think.
Yeah, I just had a small point to make, I think. I also ended up thinking, I think something similar to Peter, um, that maybe there was a problem with running together recurrence and persistence, or the production of copies of something compared to persistence. But I thought maybe a way around that, Ford, is in your reworking of Lewontin's recipe, I noticed that The first two conditions had a modification, but the third fitness condition just sort of stayed the same. And
Hmm.
maybe if there was something in there about how you want to treat maybe clade growth or the growth of the quantity of recurring things um, as some component of fitness somehow, that maybe that would help you there. If you sort of fully, if you incorporated something about clade growth and into all of the elements of the read
Yeah.
you wanted.
Uh, Maybe so. I mean, Okasha has a, a good statement in one of his books about um, elements that interactors that reappear regularly are selected for, but they don't have adaptations in the classical Darwinian sense because they don't reproduce. And so, I mean, my model would be a collective that consists of a number of particles. You know, the more successful collectives will produce more common particles, and I mean, it's just the haystack model, I think, and then those particles will form more collectives in the future. So the particular type of collective is favored, even though it has too many too many parents to evolve by a classical Darwinian mechanism. So I don't know how to handle that, or at least I don't know how to handle that standardly with the standard language.
There was a question by Sonu, I think, but I think
Yeah, he's gone.
okay.
Yeah, sorry. I had a question, but it follows some of what Tyler and Peter already mentioned. So Ford, that was a great provoking session. I just wanted to ask if nitrogen cycle is analogous to a song, and the entities or the organisms that evolved are the singers. When you look at the chain of causality, the nitrogen cycle should have some follow up, like the organisms have to precede the cycle in a sense, at least in how the universe is formed. So with the changes that is happening right now in our biosphere, and the entities might change, actually the song might change, and not just the entities. So if the song changes, how are you accounting for that plasticity within your Gaia hypothesis, and how are you maintaining the chain of causality here? If you can make that a bit clearer, I would greatly appreciate.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't make it clearer. Um, I mean, the song changing subtly over time, it's so I don't, you know, I mean, the species changes over time too, but we have no problem calling it the same species, I don't think, or, um, eh, so songs can change too. Um, and if they change too much, then we don't call them the sun song anymore. And it's a matter of, a slippery slope kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, I guess. But um,
Thank you.
yeah. I mean, so I mean the song versus the Finger series. I mean, the theory, I think hinges on the notion of recruitment. That taxa that songs recruit taxa to perform their steps, and I think they do that. I mean, they will do that through the accumulation of intermediates for those steps, for instance, so that if some element of the nitrogen cycle piles up, then or the evolutionary incentive for organisms to evolve to use that will build up too, right? So, um, so I think there are physical ways to work that out. But I don't. Other than that, I can't answer your question.
Thanks.
All right. We have, I think, one final question by Zaya. Is that, yeah.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's less of a question or not even a real problem for your argument, but I was just thinking when you were talking about us as a coherent clade and Luca, I guess I was just thinking about the theories around viruses preceding Luca and how viruses might be partially separately evolved from us. And so if you were to incorporate that thinking, maybe the language around Luca and our coherence as a clade would shift slightly.
Sure. I mean, this question often comes up, and I mean, I think the viral lifestyle clearly has existed uh, along with life, but whether current viruses are descendants of those ancient viruses is a question, because I think most current viruses consist of organismal genes that have escaped, right? And part of the
I
viral.
think maybe that thinking around that has shifted more recently. So there seems to be
Okay,
like more genetic novelty in viruses than in anywhere else, and it's very possible that some.
sure, right. Yeah. Well, I don't know that much about viruses. That I just kind of always instinctively reacted to, yes, of course, viruses have been around forever, but those particular viruses, the viruses that are around today, are they descended from those viruses or not? And I suspect they're not.
Yeah, I think with the megaviruses, there's some suggestion that potentially they represent earlier
Sure.
lineages.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting literature to get into, and it would just like
Yeah.
potentially modify some of your language around our coherence as a clade, if
Yeah.
if you found it compelling.
Yeah. I don't find it compelling, but then again, I'm not up to date on the megaviruses.
I was wrong. We have one final question, and this is still okay for you, Ford. We have one final question
Sure.
by Fridolin Gross. Fridolin.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the talk. And sorry, I don't have my camera working at the moment. A quick question. So you said in the beginning your aim is not to prove the Gaia hypothesis, but just to make it respectable or
Legitimate.
legitimate. And so
Right.
this suggests at the end it's an empirical question. Could you comment on what kind of empirical evidence we need to actually decide on it?
Right.
If it's true here in our biosphere.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you buy the Serbian argument for clade selection, the clade has been selected for persistence, and I think that's probably true. So, um, it's really hard for me to imagine an empirical test for the Gaia hypothesis. I'm just trying to again legitimize it, to Darwinize it, uh, because I think that according to Peter's classical Darwinian hypothesis, it's not legitimate. And I think that was the objection to most Darwinists initially, and is the objection to holobiont literature now. I think from classical Darwinists is that they don't see how holobionts can reproduce as an entity. So um, I'm sorry, I lost the thread now.
That was about empirical.
Oh, right. I don't know how to empirically test it. Um, I mean, in a sense, it's already been tested. That I mean, to argue that there is that kind of selection, or selection for persistence or something like that, and selection for the descendants of Luca, which probably survived for some reason other than just chance, right? Probably survived for a variety of reasons. Then that's proven. I mean, that does prove the Gaia hypothesis too. But yeah, so I guess it's proven in that sense. But we'd have to.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
All right. Before thanking again Ford, I just want to say that the next seminar will be with Kate Lynch as a speaker. She will talk on genetic causation. And as you probably know, Kate is based in Melbourne in Australia. So it's going to be at 9 a.m. French time, which is good for Australia, less good for our friends in the US. I really want to thank you, Ford, for a very good talk and for the very, very interesting discussion. So thank you to everyone, and thank you very much, Ford. That was great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And I'm sorry it was so incoherent, but that's the way it is.
It wasn't, and the questions showed that there was a lot in
Okay.
it that I think was understood and interesting and debated as well. So that was very good. Thank you, everyone,
Okay.
and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.